Thank you for joining. So, ho'an eklanete dene sotlaneta eriotse ekwe hushe duranje betsiani hesli. I just introduced myself in my Indigenous language, which is Dene or Dene Sotlane. And my name is Ariotse Ekwe Duranje, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, which is located in the Treaty 8 territories of northern Alberta in so-called Canada. And I'm really grateful for everyone that's come today to learn a little about this new global Indigenous climate justice initiative called Woven. There's a QR code on the screen if you want to check out the website. But I'm really excited to have incredible speakers here with me today, and I'll share their bios with you all. And I'm going to do a short introduction into what the Woven Project is. And then I will hand it over to Dr. Graham Reed, who will share some initial research that we've done on mapping Indigenous peoples in the global movements. And then we'll hear from a few members of the Global Indigenous Advisory Council, and we even have a couple in the audience as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about this initiative and why it's so important for Indigenous peoples globally. I'm just pulling up my slides. So again, I just want to say ho'a, thank you, Masicho, for coming here today. And I'm going to go a little bit through just the Woven Project, and then I will introduce all of the speakers, and we can hear a little bit more. So the Woven Project is an initiative that looks and aims at weaving Indigenous peoples' knowledges together. We often hear about weaving Indigenous and Western knowledges together, but what we really need to be focusing on is how we build our collective strengths as global Indigenous peoples. When we talk about Indigenous peoples, there's an often of a flattening or a pan-indigeneity, and it kind of minimizes the diversity of Indigenous peoples. And this project really aims at how we weave Indigenous knowledges together to strengthen global Indigenous peoples' movements for climate justice. At the heart of this project, we want to center sovereignty and self-determination first and foremost, and advance Indigenous-led solutions for climate justice grounded in the sacredness of ancestral knowledge, responsibilities, and aspirations. And I really want to focus on the aspirations piece. We met earlier this year in New Zealand in Aotearoa. Did I say it right? No, I didn't say it right. I can't say it right. If you had a microphone, you could say it. Aotearoa. I didn't do it right either. We talked about aspirations, and we talked a lot about how we often are caught up in responding to, as opposed to being not proactive, but sitting into the imagination and dreaming of what it means to think about our futures as Indigenous peoples. And we want to create more space for us to dream and imagine Indigenous climate futures. So we acknowledge that we stand at the forefronts of movements for Indigenous rights, self-determination, land defense, and climate action, guided by the wisdom of Indigenous peoples who have already successfully, sustainably stewarded lands, waterways, and all that we hold sacred for millennia. And as I stated, we're centered on weaving our diverse Indigenous knowledges and rights first and foremost. This will strengthen our collective strategies for sovereignty and self-determination as foundational to building and implementing effective and meaningful climate solutions. So what does that actually mean? We are going to be focusing on doing research and tools and resource development. So how can we take research for and by Indigenous peoples to support our movements both at home on the ground, but also help to build an international strategy together as Indigenous peoples? And again, we want to weave our knowledge, but how? We want to hold global convenings that are not COP, that have nothing to do with COP, that are just for us to weave our knowledges, our strengths, and our strategies together. And then we also want to develop education and training tools that are meaningful and actually wanted by our communities, determined for and by our communities. We want to look at building community support and solidarity, amplifying the work that's already happening on the ground, and looking for ways to support our communities both financially and also with the amplification and with the training and resources. We want to have global influence to say that Indigenous peoples are not just stakeholders, we are rights holders that should be having our sovereignty and self-determination respected, and particularly when it comes to land defense and land movements. And we also want to demonstrate the power of Indigenous rights-based climate solutions. A lot of time people say, what are the solutions? And a great report was shared just yesterday. It was shared at New York Climate Week. Over 700 Indigenous-led solutions have been put together in a report. Kimmerin Ryamet, I can't say his last name, I'm so bad with names. Ryamet was a big part of it, Graham was also a part of it, and that's the start. But how do we go beyond just demonstrating the projects that we do and quantify how we are actually impacting and reducing emissions globally? So the goals of this project, again, are to quantify the role and impacts of Indigenous land defense movements in avoiding and mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, to support Indigenous land back efforts. Land back is at the heart of this work, and to advance sovereignty and self-determinations. And we'll do that by building tools, resources, facilitating global knowledge exchanges, platforms to weave our strengths and capacities, providing adequate resources, and changing narratives for Indigenous land back movements. The project is led by a global Indigenous Advisory Council, and all of the members are at the forefronts of Indigenous innovation and rights advocacy that are working to shift narratives and strategies to tackling the climate crisis to actually reduce emissions. The big thing that we're going to talk about here today is we've already launched a research project that Dr. Graham Reed has helped us to map Indigenous peoples in the global movements. And these reports that we will continue to develop over the next couple years will be used to develop a suite of tools to be used by our communities to uplift local and regional and global initiatives. And the big initiative that we're wanting to do is in 2026, with the support of our partners at Common Threads, we're going to be coordinating the inaugural International Indigenous Peoples Convening to bring our strategies and voices together, again, outside of the COP spaces. We want to bring our people together to share our ideas and lean into the dreaming of what it means for Indigenous climate futures. These gatherings will allow us to cross-pollinate and share our strategies, legal strategies, challenges, victories, and cultivate space for global strategy to build powerful kinships and relationship to build a collective movement for and by Indigenous peoples. That is the heart of the Woven Project. The speakers I have with me today are as follows. Dr. Graham Reed, or just Graham Reed, who's Anishinaabe from North America. I'm not going to read your whole bio. I'm just going to go over it. When they speak, I'll have their little profiles up for you. We also have Larissa Baldwin Roberts, who's Pacific, and I can't say your community name. I'm really bad at saying things that are not my language. I'm so sorry. From Australia. We have Leo Cerda on the end, representing Latin America, and he's Quechua. We have Tiana Jakchevich, I can't say it, I'm so sorry, Pacific, Maori. We have Tunga Rai, Asia. And those are the speakers, and as again they speak, we're going to start with Graham going through our initial research that looks to map Indigenous peoples in global movements. And it's you, Graham.
Yeah, awesome. So, Anin Bojo, Graham Reed, Indigenous Cause, Anishinaabe and Dao. My name is Graham Reed. I grew up in Ottawa. My dad's side is English and Scottish, and mom's is German and Anishinaabe. My great-grandfather was born in Wakumekong. His mother was born in Thessalon. And yeah, I've had the distinct pleasure of contributing to this, but I also just think it's worthwhile really lifting up Ariel and the leadership of Ariel and bringing together and creating all of this. And so, miigwech to you, Ariel. As we were talking about this like the project and how do we think about the project, we thought it would be helpful to look at just how do Indigenous peoples exist and organize within the global environmental movement. And to do that, we did some like quick research in 3 parts. The first was really like looking at how Indigenous peoples, especially accredited Indigenous organizations, exist within 6 processes. So the 3 Rio Conventions, the Convention on Climate Change that we're here now, Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Biodiversity Convention, and then other similar bodies, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem Services, and UNEA as the UN Environmental Assembly, really just to understand, like, from that international layer, how are Indigenous peoples participating. We then had our in-person gathering at Te Roa, and then did some very specific interviews with Indigenous peoples, and then on that basis proposed just some early targeted recommendations to strengthen and consider, much of which has already been shared in Ariel's description of the Woven project. So I thought it's always worthwhile, especially because we're in the climate context, just contextualizing where we're at, and we're unfortunately going in the wrong direction. The really small icons are actually all the major stages within the UNFCCC. So the initial agreement in 97, the Kyoto Protocol, or the initial agreement in 92, the Kyoto Protocol in 97, the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, and then the Paris Agreement in 2015. And yet atmospheric concentrations of carbon and of CO2 continue to rise. And part of that reason, and part of the articulation of many Indigenous peoples who come into these spaces, is that we're not actually dealing with the root cause. And that root cause, as communicated in this document, the Reconnection Vision, is really just the notion of disconnection, and that we're disconnected from our original responsibilities and from our role as members of the natural world around us. And so really our role is to address that disconnected relationship. As we think about the complex multilateral spaces that Indigenous peoples engage in, it's just useful to understand how all of these different things really talk about the same issue, about our lands, about our rights, about our territories, but do it in different ways. And so here you see in the middle are those 3 Rio Conventions. Those Rio Conventions have created other bodies that contribute to their aspirations and their discussions, including the science policy bodies of IPES and the IPCC. They've also created funding mechanisms where predominantly countries in the global north provide to countries in the global south, and there are some exceptions where Indigenous peoples can access that. So you see the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, and the FOSS, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. You have those UN mechanisms that are dedicated to Indigenous peoples, and then emerging spaces like the UN Environmental Assembly, like the negotiations on the Plastics Treaty, and of course, the high-level political forum. And as you look at these spaces, and I thought I'd just use a couple examples that are pertinent here. First, when we actually track the accredited organizations within the UNFCCC, so where we are currently, we see that the vast majority of organizations are non-Indigenous entities and accredited organizations. And so overall, only 3% of all organizations that are accredited into this space are those that are actually framed under the Indigenous peoples constituency. And I do think it's just important to note that, accreditation is not everything, and as Ariel shared, this is not to say that we need to necessarily put our attention towards a process that is inherently colonial, but it is to say accreditation is one step towards meaningful access. And as we continue to see these spaces as tools to advocate for our messages and not to get roped into them, it is helpful to know. As you look at the distribution within the IPO constituency, it is predominantly Latin America and North America that are represented. They represent about 65% of all Indigenous accredited organizations. And as we were preparing for this and as we were discussing it in Rotorua and Aotearoa, who are saying currently there's only one accredited organization from the Pacific under the IPO. As we potentially go to the Pacific, that's a big question of how Indigenous peoples can appropriately represent themselves, not as NGOs, not as party overflow badges, but as Indigenous organizations. And as you probably could imagine, this trend is not uncommon. So here we know that it represents about 3%. In the IPCC, there's only 2 Indigenous organizations that are accredited. In the UNGA, it's still less than 2%, or UNEA is less than 2%. And a similar story within the Convention to Combat Desertification and the CBD. The CBD has the highest percentage, and it's only about 10% of overall Indigenous accredited organizations. So as we look at the trends across those different investigations of observer status and accredited observers, you can see that there is the highest percentage, generally 75% or more, that are accredited organizations from either NGOs, RINGOs, or business organizations, and the vast majority of those are originating from the global north. And we know that this likely brings some level of knowledge framework that may not always be consistent with Indigenous peoples. As we look at the Indigenous accredited organizations, they're a small fraction, 12% being the largest. Within the Indigenous peoples accredited organizations, Latin America and North America are the highest number, followed by Asia and then a couple other regions. And then really to help organize this, and we're in a space organized by one of these, Indigenous peoples have set up their own constituency bodies, their own caucuses that are generally mechanisms for strengthening and supporting Indigenous peoples' participation, which has been key to advocate and to support for Indigenous peoples within these spaces. On the next so in every, and before we mapped out those different multilateral spaces, here you just see how Indigenous peoples have organized themselves to respond to those processes. So, here we're sitting in the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. We have our International Indigenous Youth Forum on Climate Change. We have our different advisory groups within the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility. We have a forum within IPBES. We have a fairly robust forum that's establishing itself within the plastics context and the negotiations of the Plastic Treaty, and of course the Global Indigenous Youth Council and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, all of which are important opportunities not only to communicate within individuals' conventions, but also together, and how to strengthen that communication between those different bodies of Indigenous peoples. As you look at the different Indigenous organizations that are accredited to these different spaces, you see that the vast majority, and that's the bottom line, are generally accredited to 2 processes, but there are about 15 or so that are accredited to more than 3, and about 3 or 4 that are accredited to 5 processes. And so, this is also just to show that there are certain Indigenous organizations that have insight into these different spaces, but by and large, Indigenous peoples will, participate in one process, seek observer status, and then contribute. And then only when they have the capacity to do so wider, then they'll strengthen that and they'll see their different spaces across these spaces. So what does this mean in practice, and how do we, how do we consider what are the lessons for this process and for the discussions? First, that there are challenges to Indigenous participation within any UN space, and generally we can categorize those into 3 different categories. So just like procedural and linguistic, we know that accreditation continues to be challenging. We know that the dominance of English is exceptionally challenging as well. The intersessional work between sessions. So we have the biggest number of Indigenous peoples participating at COP currently in the history of the UNFCCC, but maintaining that participation intersessionally, even into the June session, will fall dramatically, and it will become much more challenging to support our participation because it's not the same sort of opportunity that the COP presents. Logistical challenges, and of course, just of course, just epistemic and tokenistic. How do we engage in a space that is colonial and that actually is focused on the reduction of our knowledge systems? Finally, just that notion of navigating that international, domestic, what is the relevancy of participating in these global spaces, and how do we navigate the challenges with state recognition and policies? And then just finally, and I'll turn it back, and Ariel spoke about a lot of the way in which that the Woven Project is taking this on, but what are these opportunities to invest in training, mentorship, capacity strengthening? How do we ensure that continuity, that knowledge transmission to the next generation? How do we be more thoughtful about technical positions and policies? We've been quite successful this time in just transition and being really targeted for the recommendations that the caucus is bringing. But how do we continue to do that? How do we do that proactively? How do we expand our collaboration and partnership? But how do we do that in a way from strength and power within Indigenous peoples and our organizations? And then just finally, how do we consider organizing these strategic convenings and solidarity actions? And then what does the next steps for our research and our ongoing work is really actually finalizing the report and releasing it publicly. We're confirming just specific quotations from the interviews. Part of this at the very beginning was also doing a global scan and mapping of Indigenous organizations internationally. And so we've actually started the process. We have a pretty robust list of about 250 organizations from all 7 UN sociocultural regions that are working globally, regionally, and locally. And how do we use that just to show the depth and breadth of work that Indigenous peoples are leading? And then consider moving forward, how do we develop research that is supportive for Indigenous peoples and the movement more broadly? And with that, miigwech, and really grateful for this opportunity.
I just wanted to reiterate that this initial research was looking at how Indigenous peoples are currently navigating and organizing international UN spaces. And we want to acknowledge that there's limitations to that research because it doesn't look at the groups on the ground that are outside of the UN processes. But I think what we're trying to demonstrate that it's really hard to actually become an accredited organization. Less than 3% in the UNFCCC, with even failing numbers in other UN mechanisms. And there is a need to coordinate Indigenous peoples without those barriers that exist to participate. And it will help us to have that cross-pollination to share those strategies, because often what we heard when we met in New Zealand earlier this year is that we don't often know what other people are doing. In addition to not understanding what people are doing, we also don't understand where the funds and the resources are coming from. And so trying to share amongst ourselves outside of these spaces became really, really important for us to talk about how we do that effectively. And so this brings me to my next question, and I'm going to pass it over to Larissa first, and I will put her little... And so when we're thinking about this work and the limitations that Graham outlined in the report, why do you think an organization that's working outside of these mechanisms to coordinate people is so important, and how does it relate to strengthening the work that you do back home?
This kind of global Indigenous project and how it's emerging for us, and I'm just speaking for across Australia, but I think more broadly in terms of Indigenous peoples that are living in the global north under settler colonial governments, we have specific challenges. And I think when we come into these spaces, or maybe what we experience domestically as well, is that we're sandwiched between the environmental groups who believe in a notion of a land without people, and the technocratic people who believe in a transition and they'll leave it to the market and essentially green capitalism. And so for us in our region, the reality is like we are doing the work and adapting, like Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people are doing the work of adaptation, mitigation and resilience. It's the same thing that's Indigenous climate action, but we're just doing that as part of our culture and part of our responsibility. I think part of the issue that we see is that we have an enormous amount of funding that's moving in and over our heads in terms of like what organizations are funded, in terms of NGOs. Also, our structures are like community-based organizations, just people out on country doing their work. They're not NGOs. And so they're not even being accredited into this space. They're not even recognized within our movement. And so I feel like we're constantly in this argument around asserting ourselves as rights-based constituencies versus people seeing us as a kind of equity and inclusion piece of like diversity. And I think that's a really big issue for us because, you know, what it means is Australia is an incredibly wealthy country, but the amount of money that's actually coming directly to our communities is very, very limited. But also on the back of that, what we see is like, it's also coming through really dodgy mechanisms. So, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but like the role of offsets paying for Indigenous land protection, like we're getting money that's coming from big corporations that are destroying another Indigenous people's land, and they're using greenwashing tactics basically to put land defenders out on other parts of country. And I think that in itself is an incredibly unjust system. But also within Australia, we are significantly reliant on public financing from our government. At the same time, our communities, you know, are in, you know, a fight since colonisation with our government around our land and territories and what that actually means to assert our rights. So to me, I think the benefit of having a global project that sits outside the UN space, it's like, it's a time to do our own business, to think about our strategies, how we move forward. And I also would say this is just like, what are the spaces that actually fill up the cup of land defenders and frontline communities? Because in our region, we are losing so many land defenders, not just to like the well-being and how the toll that takes on their health, but to suicide. Like people just becoming increasingly disillusioned with not getting anywhere fast enough. And so I think that global strategy space around understanding strategies, understanding what's working, understanding how we translate them, like we are ready to adapt to anything as Indigenous peoples globally. So I think it gives us the opportunity to hold that space and also hold the justifiable anger that we bring into these spaces as well without having to constantly explain why or justify our place or fight for position. I think I have a lot of respect for, and I've learned so much from the global Indigenous movement, but I want that experience to be able to be shared with like our frontline land defenders as well.
Thank you, Larissa. I think that that's a really important point, is that it's not just about organizations, coordinated like entities that are nonprofit or charitable organizations. Our people are actually doing this work on the ground already, and there's no spaces for them to come in to share those successes, those challenges, to access resources. And it's very exclusionary space for entering into climate discourse. And so I'm going to pass it over to Leo, because Latin America was the number one body of organizations that is represented within these mechanisms. Yet, do you think that having a coordinated body that functions outside of these UN spaces will support the work of Latin America? And what are the challenges that still exist to coordinating folks in Latin America with the broader Indigenous community globally?
Hola, hola. Is it working? I think that is the challenge, right? What we have said here is that we need to center Indigenous leadership, and by centering Indigenous leadership is the only path forward for climate policy solutions. And the only spaces that we have right now are co-opted, right? Are co-opted by the fossil fuel industry, by lobbyists, even more so by lobbyists, Indigenous people's lobbyists for these big NGOs as well, because a lot of us have to work in these spaces and try to find pathways to move policy forward that we get lost within those big NGO spaces. And I think having an organization that is dedicated to center Indigenous leadership, co-create capacity, and train the next generations. Because it is important right now that, like, I was a young Indigenous leader at some point, but that is no longer the truth, right? We need to pass that to the next generations in terms of knowledge, capacity, training. Who is going to do our work? And we need to make sure that we have that capacity available for the next generations, because a lot of us that are in these spaces, we have been like juggling many different works, organizations, and things. And what about if we have one organization that will focus on training the people, for not only for the UNCCC, but for all the different organizations that we need indigenous people, voices, leadership, in order to move climate policy solutions forward. So for me, that is the important thing. How are we as indigenous peoples going to center the values and the demands and the solutions and the policies forward for the different spaces that we are in?
Thank you, Leo. I think that's an important articulation. You know, often there's a lot of conversations where the global north dominates these spaces. And so in the research that Graham did, it was really illuminating to see how Latin America was really strong. But the reality is that the global north is very dominant. So I'm going to go to Tunga next, because I think that Asia and the region in Asia, they were the third largest, yet there's a lot of separation and a lot of, we're not working across the different territories within the UN spaces enough. How do we bridge that divide? Do you think that it can be successfully done outside of UN spaces to cultivate more partnerships between the global south and the global north?
Thank you. Namaskar, everyone. My name is Tunga Rai, indigenous nation from Nepal, from the mountains of the country. So thank you for this opportunity, and also thank you, Graham, for setting the context. So as indigenous peoples at the international level, we have been able to secure some of our spaces. However, as Errol raised question, there are a lot of challenges. I would say in words, disconnection and dilution. Even if we have been fighting for our unity, solidarity, and rights together, we see a lot of disconnection. First, picking up landscapes, speaking of one landscape and keeping another landscape apart from the conversation. We hear many times countries talk about, for example, Himalayas and mountains. They don't take rainforest or Amazon together with the Himalayas. And we have been hearing about rainforest and other ecosystem and landscapes, but this is such a disconnection. This is picking things in isolation. It goes same with the indigenous peoples. No matter where we live, our core issue is really connection to our land, territories, and resources. That is really the root of our identity and everything as a whole. But speaking of indigenous peoples of global south or global north is disconnection. That really is the disconnection of our solidarity and our issue. So I'm saying here, we really need to reconnect, revitalize, and rethink about this trend. This has come in the name of climate finance, climate action, or several other. So the trend I see in our region and globally is this species has been used as a new tools or new forum for new forms of colonization. Climate finance, climate action, or any assistance should not be new tool for new forms of colonization. But I think at least I have been experiencing that. You know, you pick up landscape and you ignore the rest. You pick up the territory or peoples of certain territory, you ignore the rest. This is a total disconnection and disrespect of indigenous peoples as collective people. So this is a huge challenge, but still I think we can overcome these challenges as a region and also as a people, indigenous peoples globally. I think the first step we should take up is we are people. I talk about yaks and mountains, but people from the Arctic, they talk about reindeers and their grazing land. There is no difference in substance. It's the same thing. Likewise, it goes to Amazon. You talk about your Amazon forest and your liveways and everything. But the thing is, it's about our root. It's about our root. So, precisely my final comment would be, they are trying to dismantle our roots in different ways and different forms. But we really re-energize and revitalize our root. So that should not dilute our core issues. So this dilution comes in the form of a terminology, in the form of defining our territory, which does not exist in our practice, which does not exist in national and international law. I can tell you some examples. Customary land tenure and customary liveways and laws exist in our communities. That's our way of life. We live with it. It's our reality. And that exists in UN DRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But some of the terminologies and invention they are imposing us does not exist in either side of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tunga. I'm going to bring you, I brought you last specifically because as a young person who's been growing up in these movements, Tiana, we've heard a lot from the speakers here around the importance of working together and understanding the diversity, not just in our own regions, but globally as an Indigenous peoples movement. And you helped to coordinate and host the Global Indigenous Advisory Council in your territories in a marae, in culture, in ceremony. And how do you feel like, what is the role of that cross-pollination across the North, the South, and intercultural for Indigenous peoples? And why is it critical not just for the movements, but for your own people back home? And particularly as a young person.
There. Can everybody hear me? Okay, sweet. Yeah, well, first and foremost, I'm not going to be as articulate as all of my tuakana here, but kia ora everybody, my name is Tiana, I come from Aotearoa. I think to begin, when we look at what it means to be Indigenous, both at home and abroad, it first and foremost comes back to our whenua, our land. If we come from our land, we must return to our land, so that must always be front and center of our minds. And I think that the connection that we have inherently with our land is what has also connected all of us here. And while we meet in these halls under trying circumstances, I think we've also found global solidarity and global connection, which we don't generally see in other spaces. And I actually think that that's a strength of the Indigenous movement, is to find your people that are committed to not only the fight within these halls, but what is the collective revitalization of all of our cultures? Because we understand that we're not free until we're all free. So how are we going to work together? How are we going to make sure that Lao in Ecuador, Tunga in Nepal is looked after and heard to the same level as people that have more access? And I think too, like, this COP's really interesting, and it's a good test case. We may have more presence, but we don't have more power. And a project like Woven flips the narrative, where it's a creation of power for us to come together collectively from a strength-based approach to figure out how we want to collectively work together, to create time to be together in community, in our traditional places, because from understanding where we come from, we understand where we need to go. And if we think about Woven, it's come from a prophecy of your people, you know? That is also front and center of all of our minds as we move forward in this work. And I think, like, yeah, that's the only way that we can continue.
I think that Tiana spoke a little bit about prophecy and where did Woven come from? And I think that this is an important part of the story. And I'll do another one last round of questions. But essentially, For myself, I've been working within climate justice work for 20 years at this point, and I kind of like Tiana, I grew up in these spaces, in UN forums and halls, but also on the front lines with my own community. And my community is downstream from one of the largest industrial projects on planet Earth, the Alberta tar sands, which is the second largest oil reserve in the world. And it has completely devastated my community. And now they're trying to greenwash it with carbon trading and biodiversity offsets and all sorts of different things that don't actually substantively change the lives of our peoples. But in 2009, I attended the Anchorage Global Indigenous Peoples Summit in Anchorage, Alaska. And it was one of the only times that I've seen global Indigenous peoples come together outside of UN processes in a way that was beautiful and magical, where we were able to not just come and talk about all the policies and how we're going to fight governments, which we did a little bit, but we also shared ceremony. We also shared stories. We also shared our capacities as Indigenous peoples to explore the diversity of our strengths, of our culture, and where we come from. And for me, it was a really catalyzing moment for me to see how, as Indigenous peoples, we need more spaces like that. And there have been very few spaces that have created those connections between the climate movement and our cultures. And I really wanted to see that happen again. But the prophecy that I learned at that gathering was that during the last ice age, our people saw the changes on the land. They saw that the temperatures were changing. They saw it was getting colder. And there was a call of the Great Council from the four corners of Turtle Island. And they said that we had to put down all of our conflicts and our disputes and come together to share our knowledge of the land, from the seeds to the waters, to the animals, to shelters. And we needed to share that knowledge amongst ourselves in order to survive the changes on the land. And at that time, when they had this great council, it was prophesied that there would be another time far in the future in which the land would change once again in some of the most drastic ways. And that once again, but this time from all four corners of the world, we would have to come together to share those knowledges of our lands, of our waters, of our seeds, of our medicines and our plants in order to survive the pending changes. And it was prophesied that we are now entering that time. And in order for us to survive, we need to stop just reacting and responding to colonial systems, but we need to come together to share our knowledges as Indigenous peoples, as stewards of the land, as those that still have those connections and maintain those relationships, so that we can share it amongst our brothers and sisters that share that same interconnected relationship in order to survive. But we spend so much of our time just reacting to colonial governments, to colonial systems. And as Indigenous peoples, we know that some of the most beautiful and important articulations of how we win strategy comes when we eat together, when we dance together, when we pray and have ceremony together. It's not in stuffy halls that are put together in UN venues. It's when we come together in relationship and kinship. And that is where the idea for Woven really, really came from. And this gets me to my last question for each one of the panelists, and you can go in whatever order you'd like. But essentially, these UN spaces have been one of the only spaces for Indigenous peoples to come together globally to coordinate. The Indigenous caucuses, and I'm going to go back to the slide from Graham's presentation, these, that's the wrong direction. All of these different mechanisms and bodies that have been created for Indigenous peoples to coordinate in these international spaces have been really important. But they don't hold space for kinship. They don't hold space for relationship and ceremony. So while the UN spaces have been an important space for our people, how do we take that strength from this and bring it back to those communities that don't have accreditation, that don't even understand these UN mechanisms? And how do you feel that a global gathering to bring our Indigenous peoples can support doing that for our people moving forward? And Graham, I'm also going to ask you to answer a question.
Go first.
I think that it's we don't in this space get to acknowledge the vast amount of like knowledge that we hold, not just in terms of Indigenous knowledges, but we have adapted to this colonial system in the way that we have so many leading experts. And I think sometimes all that expert information is focused towards the state, and we need to focus that energy into our own peoples and make sure that we have a proper understanding, like in our communities, around where our rights are at and what is the ongoing fight and where are we at together. So to me, it's like taking stock of where we are and how much further we have to go forward.
I was like, I don't know what the question was. I knew you were going to say that. The UN spaces and the UN Indigenous caucuses and bodies, they've become a really important space. But how do we take a space like Woven, which brings us out? Why, like, how is it necessary, and how can we how can we take the lessons learned from this and bring it outside of the UN to strengthen our movements?
Whoa. I think we need to find a space, but also we need to acknowledge that we prepare all year round for this kind of events, because we work like world policy wide, you know, Indigenous policy, climate solutions, IFIP, but we also have the issues that we deal with back home. And I think it's a great idea. Like, have you seen like the World Social Forum? I think we need to do something like that. I was just at a conference before coming here, and we're talking about how are we going to take up the spaces that already exist and convert it into our own, right? How are we going to tackle that? Because, like, for example, in this conference, I went to a workshop, and in the US, there is this huge festival that is called the Essence Festival, where a lot of the Black and Afro-American community meets and engage. And they literally said, we're gonna take over that space, and we're gonna talk about reproductive rights and trans rights, and they have done that. And then we have that example in the US. I was like, oh my God, damn, we need to do something like that. And then in Brazil, we have Tylee here. In Brazil, they have one of the biggest indigenous camps in the whole world, you know? Well, they go for a week to the capital of Brazil and then engage in this like huge indigenous social camp forum. And they talk about leadership, kinship, ceremony, singing, protest. And they say, okay, this year, this is the issue, and this is gonna deal with it. I think we need to reproduce those kind of examples that we've seen from Indigenous peoples and from people of color from around the world. I think that is what we need, because we need to be able to communicate and create kinship and create collectiveness, because the only path forward is about existing. Because most oftentimes, as Indigenous people, you are set to resist, and it's only by resisting and existing. For me, the only path forward is just existing, and that is what we need to do: create kinship, collective work, because for Indigenous people and as Indigenous people, we do co-create, and we move forward collective, and that's what we need to find.
I'm going to tweak the question a little bit for you, Tunga. Thank you there. Tunga, do you think that these UN mechanisms and these spaces have been useful for our people? And if not, what is the alternative?
No, it has not been, because I would say these UN spaces and all these so-called modern forums are not the way we share our knowledge, we share our experiences. I would say why, because our knowledge does not exist in books and libraries. It exists with our dance, it exists with our songs, it exists with our fabrics and weaving and carving and all of these things and paintings and everything. So the way this UN and the national mechanism defines experts and knowledge holders are the ones who holds degree from the universities and whatever. But we really need to change the definition of our knowledge holders and experts. Those are the experts, those are the knowledge holders who practice our science on the ground. But this UN system does not recognize this kind of science and those experts. So this forum does not really work for us. So if open movement would like to see some global gathering or do something, then change the paradigm, go back to the original way of saying things and interpreting things, so that we can get to the real people and real knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to do things a little bit again. Same thing. How these systems work? What are the things that our communities need besides global gathering space? Like, what kinds of tools and resources do you feel are necessary for our people?
Also, no, they don't work. I think that international space brought us all together, but it won't bring us back to our lands, and it won't bring us back to each other. And so I think that a gathering outside of this space is exactly that, to bring us back together, to bring us back to collective solutions. This space does a great job of starting to do that, but the foundation can only ever be where we come from. I also think that these spaces force you to be really reactionary. It's a privilege to be here fighting for our peoples, and that is why we're here. But it is our obligation to take the lessons and learnings back home. And I think the only way that we can actually do the work that we do is to also think of, I think there's 475 million Indigenous peoples globally, but there's only ever 200, 300 Indigenous peoples actively engaged in this space. So what is our duty to think of those at the forefront of our mind? And I think that this space can't work because even this is not how we gather. We don't gather and speak at, we speak with. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Tiana. Okay, I'm going to tweak it again. Do these spaces work? And as someone who's done this research, what types of research and tools do our people need to support us to enter into these spaces better?
Yeah, and as everyone was sharing, one thing I was thinking about in the research, there is no one in any Indigenous organization that I can think of that works on these processes full time. Which look at the big NGOs, look at the states, look at all those business lobbyists, they work on these issues full time. And I don't think the expectation should be that we are, but to think strategically about how we interface with these systems. And that's what I see the role of strategic gathering, the development of tools, is not how do we enter in this space and react, it's how do we enter into this space as collectivities and think thoughtfully about what we need to do to ensure the protection of our rights, of our lands, of our knowledge systems, etc. Because I think Kenneth Deere always says it, and it was said here, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But my question is always, how do we ensure that table is constructed in a way that it's responsive to our issues as Indigenous peoples, but also our knowledge systems. And that's why I think these gatherings are so important. I would love to spend way more time thinking about how do we ensure everybody entering this space can understand it to the greatest extent that is possible. Because it's its own language, it's its own jargon, it's its own just process. And most people who are entering it for the first time, either it takes 1 or 2 cups even to understand the rhythm and how the different spaces interact. And so what can we as a global movement do to prepare our leaders, our young people, our knowledge holders to actually understand that process and to participate where it's meaningfully, but then leave when it starts to get inappropriate or not inclusive for these issues. And so maybe that's something, as I think about research and just thinking about looking at all the work on the ground, one thing is we're interfacing in different knowledge systems. And so in this system, we operate very much in a written system. A lot of the processes are driven by written submissions by different organizations. In many Indigenous cultures, it's an oral system. And so how are we translating those two systems and bringing it into conversation with one another? And in looking at all of these organizations internationally, the amount of work that they do is incredible. And so how are we just giving visibility to that work, to lift up that work, and then bring it into these other spaces? Because that's part of the challenge, I think, and just really committing to and engaging in that strengths-based advocacy of Indigenous peoples.
I'm going to bring it up at the end with you, Larissa, because COP maybe still on the fence, being held in Australia next year. So as an Indigenous person, do you think these systems are working for our people? And B, what lessons can we take from this to help strategize to mobilize people to be better prepared for these spaces?
I mean, these systems get us so far, but I think there's a barrier to like how we, like even on, I think we're still having a significant conversation around why Indigenous communities deserve direct finance. I'm just like, that feels like we've been here for 10 years having that conversation and we're still accessing finances. So it's the frustration point. I think that's where I get to with this. Like, it's worthwhile, but also I'm frustrated at the process. Is there a better process? I think that's where I'm at. I think leading into COP31 in Australia, like this is incredible. This was billed as an Indigenous COP, not the Indigenous Peoples COP, and I think there's a difference between that. I think coming to potentially to Adelaide or Tandenya and having a conversation around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have like 65% of it's all Aboriginal land, but 65% of the land mass comes under Indigenous tenure, I think. And so I think there's a real live conversation there that we can help drive forward with the global movement around what does this mean in terms of land defense? What does it mean in terms of land back? Like putting tangible understanding to the broader, movement here around what does land back actually mean and what does that return look like? What does reparations mean in this context? Because we're not having the conversation about reparations in the same way from our domestic governments. But I think, that's not going to be in the rule book, but there needs to be a political mobilization around that. So I like the idea of the way that we organise politically and how we've always garnered influence from global movements and justice movements more broadly. But I think we also have something to offer in this fight. And what I love about our mob is just like we don't take any step backwards in telling the government straight around how it is. So if the government isn't going to do what needs to be done, then they will be banging down the doors like this mob did here as well. So come to Australia, they will be held accountable by our mob. To who?
So I think I want to wrap this up with one articulation. So during our meeting in New Zealand in May earlier this year, we talked a lot about land and land, like sovereignty and self-determination over our land. And we really landed on the fact that this work needs to center around land back, whether that's land tenure through the sort of official tracts or land defense movements for land back, really uplifting the fact that we have the right, as defined by Article 18 and other systems, to self-determine how we want to participate in these processes through our own systems of governance. And yet we are constantly told we have to bend and shift ourselves and our strategies to colonial systems. And so we talked a lot about how do we move from just having a voice to having power and having autonomy and relationships with our lands and territories, and how land back isn't about ownership and dominion over land, but about restoring our relationships with our places of origin and our ancestors. And so we really wanted to look, as part of our next research project, that we really want to look at all the people that would come to this inaugural global gathering to help us understand what the needs are, but also help us map Indigenous land defense movements that are often unseen and unheard of, and how we can move towards quantifying how Indigenous land movements are already protecting critical biodiversity, critical systems that are necessary for climate stabilization. And how do we quantify that so that we're not criminalized when we defend our lands and territories? So that when they come knocking down the doors of the UN spaces, they're not looked at as villains, but as people that should be upheld and celebrated as climate champions. And so we really see that movements for land back are completely connected to restoring our relationships with the land as Indigenous peoples, and also empowering us to step into these spaces with real articulated power that says we are not criminals, we are not the villain in the story trying to stop progress. We are actually trying to advance real solutions that are grounded in kinship and interconnectedness and relationship. And that our systems of governance, our systems of and ways of being, from economies to education to child rearing to all of the ways we interact with our natural world, are critical to building the new system. We talk about how these systems don't work. We need transformation and systemic change, and it cannot be done replicating these same systems over and over again. It's time for us to move towards real decolonization. I want to acknowledge that our brothers and sisters from Africa and the Arctic were not here. Some of them had to leave early. And our brother Kimmerin from Africa, from Kenya specifically, wanted to come, but his badge was already expired, so he could not sit on the panel with us today. But the work that's being done in these territories is super critical to acknowledge the voices that often get left out of this, particularly African voices and particularly voices from the Arctic, because the Arctic doesn't have trees. And Africa, let's just talk about it's real. There is serious systemic racism against Black people still in the globe. And we need to acknowledge those barriers, and as Indigenous peoples, we need to continue to come together. As part of that, Kimmerin has offered to host the Global Advisory to meet to really plan our strategies for the next steps for this project next year. And we will be looking to invite people to share their stories of resiliency on our website, which is a QR code on the wall. I'll put it up here later. There's a forum if you want to share stories. We want to amplify those stories on the ground and build them into our research projects. So we invite all Indigenous peoples from all over the world to join this initiative, to learn more about the gathering that we're planning to host before COP next year, that is just for Indigenous peoples and not going to be all about policy, but unless we wanted to. And this is going to be our own self-determined sovereign process for building an international climate justice movement. Because for far too long, too many of us have been doing this work off the side of our desks, doing other projects, and we need to have an organization that is holding our communities and providing them with resources and tools to support them to build their own sovereign solutions. That is what Woven is for. It is not to be the voice, but to support those that are already doing the work. So I welcome you and invite you all to join and follow Woven as we build. We are brand new. We are just getting off the ground, but we won't be able to do it without people, the people. I am just one person. The Advisory Council are just also singular people from different regions of the world. But our strength comes when we work together and collaborate and share our stories and learn from each other and build the solutions that we so desperately need to decolonize and build real systems of climate justice for Indigenous peoples. So with that, I want to thank each one of my panelists for not just coming here today, but for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your strategies and strengths in building the Woven project to be what it needs to be and the hope for our future. And I'd like to share a small gift with each one of you.